Here is the first video in our series on Latin indirect statement, and let's begin at the beginning. Let's make it simple to begin, and hopefully let us keep it simple by looking at English indirect statement. Direct statement is any utterance of an alleged fact. It doesn't need to be a true fact, it just needs to be an alleged fact. And here is one: my Redeemer liveth. Here is another: I know nothing. And another: there are 36 inches to 1 yard. All taxation is theft. There you are. 4 utterances of alleged facts, and there are good arguments for saying that every one of these is a true fact. However, let's pass to indirect statement. This is an alleged fact uttered as a report, a belief, or a perception. Have a look at these. I know that my Redeemer liveth. I believe that I know nothing. We see that there are 36 inches to 1 yard. Some say that all taxation is theft. You'll see that we do indirect statements in English by using the that construction. Let's have a look at that. Let's look at its geography. You begin with a leading verb. That's the verb in first place in the sentence, but you begin with a leading verb that shows some use of the intellect or of the senses. So, I know. Following this, you have a subordinating conjunction on which you hang your statement of alleged fact. I know that. And finally, you have the alleged fact. I know that all taxation is theft. That's how it works. A very simple construction and a very useful construction. And although this chart is purely superfluous, I did spend a lot of time earlier working on it, and I feel reluctant to leave it out. So here you have the statement of alleged fact, all taxation is theft, recast as indirect statement with a verb using the intellect or the senses. Let's go from senses round, shall we? I hear that all taxation is theft. I see that all taxation is theft. I am told that all taxation is theft. I say that all taxation is theft. I believe that all taxation is theft. I know that all taxation is theft. I am certain that all taxation is theft. There, see, a very simple and a very useful and indeed a very powerful construction. It has 3 parts. You begin with a leading verb, which indicates some use of the intellect or of the senses. You have the subordinating conjunction that, which shows you that your statement of alleged fact, when you finally give it, will hang from that leading verb. And then you have the alleged fact. You have the statement. I've laboured this a bit. I've laboured it even though it is such a simple construction that we use all the time and that probably doesn't need that much explaining. Or it doesn't need that much explaining if you're simply talking about English. But when you turn to a language like Latin, it is very useful to understand exactly how we do indirect statements in English. Now, there are alternative constructions in English that we can use. There are 3 constructions in English that we can use for indirect statement. There is, of course, the subordinating conjunction. I know that all taxation is theft. You can also use what's called the infinitive and accusative construction. I'll say much more about this later on. Some say all taxation to be theft. You have a leading verb, and although we don't have cases in English, you can take taxation and theft to be accusatives, and you have the infinitive to be. So some say all taxation to be theft. It's an alternative way of doing indirect statement. It's used far less often in English than the subordinating conjunction construction, but it is a valid way of doing indirect statement. Then there's the participle construction. We see all taxation as being theft. We don't use this very often. Indeed, you'll notice the being in angle brackets, because if we do use this construction, we very often leave out the participle. We see all taxation as theft, but even if we've left it out, you might say that the participle being is still floating there, invisible, but still with a certain amount of gravity. Or you can find a slightly more natural example. We see a yard as comprising 36 inches. I think that does work. It's a little strange, but it's not unusually strange. All this having been said, something that we must bear continually in mind for the rest of this course is that spoken Latin did allow the subordinating conjunction construction. Scio quod redemptor meos vivit, or scio quod redemptor meos vivat, if you want to use the subjunctive, and some writers occasionally did. But although you will see this in St. Jerome's translation of the Bible into Latin, although you will see it in some early Latin texts, during the classical period, during the 400 or 500 years, when Latin literature was pretty well monopolized by the senatorial classes, this was not allowed in writing. You will see the occasional use of it creeping through, where a writer appears to have nodded off slightly with a pen in his hand. But generally speaking, when a Roman took a pen into his hand, he would not use that quad construction. Oh, it was used by everybody. It's not simply vulgar Latin. That is the language spoken by the ordinary people, the ordinary, unwashed, uneducated people. The subordinating conjunction construction was used by all Romans, by the emperor himself when he was addressing his cabinet, by senators when they were outside the Senate chamber and not giving a speech. But when any Roman took a pen into his hand, the only approved construction for indirect statement was to use the accusative and infinitive form. Scio redemptorem meum vivere. I know my Redeemer to live. The result often looks rather clumsy when literally translated into English, but I'll say now, I'll doubtless say it again later on, but I'll say now that if you were to judge other languages by how they looked literally translated into English, there is not a single foreign language, living or dead, which would pass that test. The test is not how it sounds literally translated into English, but whether it works in its own right. And the Romans wanted to use the accusative and infinitive construction for indirect statement, in written Latin at least. That's what they did, and it works perfectly well. But although we do have this accusative and infinitive construction in English, it is relatively unusual, and so indirect statement in Latin is one of the main difficulties faced by English-speaking learners of Latin. The purpose of this course is to try, in some degree, to demystify Latin indirect statement.